All right, this is for Dean Massaro's Preparing for Lives in the Law. This is an interview with Professor Ratner, and this is Elizabeth Townsend. All right, first question is, why did you decide to go to law school, and was it what you expected when you got there?
Why did I decide to go to law school? I decided to go to law school because my father was a law professor. My oldest brother had already gone to law school, and I thought the topics would be interesting. It was all familiar. I think also I decided to go to law school because I was still looking for something that I would be good at. It turned out to be sort of true and sort of not true, but I was at the time I also applied for and was thinking about going to economics graduate school, but I got admitted to law school, so I ended up doing a combined joint degree, but just seemed real comfortable and real normal to me, and I think that's because of my family background as much as anything else.
And was it when you got there?
I was a little surprised how rigid it was, and I was expecting a little bit more of an intellectual experience out of the students and out of the professors. And some of that was probably expectation based on what every day of my life was like dealing with a law professor. But it was a little more rigid and a little less dynamic than I expected it to be, actually.
How are you different from your father as a law professor? Are you much different, or you see similarities?
I'm a lot different, actually. My mom taught a cooperative nursery school, preschool, for about 20 years. And my dad taught law, and while they were doing that, I used to tell them both that I thought they were in the same business. And I still think that the more I've taught law school and now had children, the more I think that is true. And in a lot of ways, as a teacher, I'm more like my mom's model than like my dad's model. I wish I were as intellectually capable as my dad. I still haven't run into anybody who really could sort of touch him on most things. But he was not very patient with his students, including his children who were students, and I don't think he took the time to make sure people really were getting what he was talking about, and I think he had a large amount of intellectual impatience. And more, I adopt the model of dealing with 3-year-olds and 4-year-olds, and so in that way, I think I like to play a lot more and like to laugh, but I do have a lot of the same intensity and focus on a particular topic and figure out what you're going to do with that topic that my dad had.
Do you think that's generational? Do you think that law professors are different now? I mean, obviously you're, very specific, what you just said, but in terms of sort of moving away from a more intellectually impatient model, do you think they have to be more patient now?
I don't think law professors are more patient now, actually. I do think it's different in law school now. I went to law school in what I sort of refer to as the last vestiges of the reign of terror, where the overwhelming model for motivating students was fear of bad performance, fear that you would not understand. And that's one thing about the Socratic method is it's with a premise of, well, if you're bewildered and you sit down and you struggle every day and try and figure it out, you will figure it out. And that is true. I don't think that's true in law schools anymore, but that's come sort of at a cost. It's very interesting. I think the people who are now teaching law school were educated in the 60s, and the higher education in the 60s turned sort of touchy-feely in general, and I think that has spilled over into law school. So there's a lot more of a sort of, well, anything goes, and anything I say is appropriate, and anything I say is quality education, and I think that change has gone along with it. But I also think the old model of law professor was arrogant, authoritative, not to be questioned as an intellectual matter, and I think that has changed just because it wasn't true about law professors. They were arrogant, but they were subject to a whole lot of questioning. I think a lot of that broke down.
Did your dad have practice experience, or was he?
Yeah, he practiced for a long time. He was Roger Trainer's first law clerk, and then he went into World War II and he practiced with the Navy, and then he practiced for from 1946 until 1959, and then with three shrieking children, decided he didn't want to practice anymore and he wanted to go into law teaching.
Interesting. And how important, one of the questions we continually ask both faculty and the alumni is, how important is having experience? I mean, this whole move to JD, PhD, and sort of all those sorts of things, how important and how much experience should law professors have before they?
I think they ought to practice law. I think it ought to be a prerequisite. For me, it was extremely useful in teaching and in understanding what the real dilemmas are and how law actually gets used. And it's real important. It's important because students, ultimately, most of them are not going to be law academics, but instead are going to go practice, so you need to know that. You need to know what practice is like. But it also framed the questions. I found practice to be incredibly intellectually interesting and framed questions in a useful way. I'll tell you something else that in addition to kicking the desk, that was really helpful to me about practice was that preparing for class is extremely similar to preparing for a deposition or a cross-examination of a witness. Every sentence, everything that goes on in class ought to have a reason, ought to have a point, ought to have a focus. And it was extremely useful to have that work habit already set up when I sat down to think about what do I want to accomplish for a particular day in a particular class. I think it is a mistake for people to not practice law. You really get things when you practice law. I make a joke about this, but I don't believe students really get summary judgment when they are in law school. They write stuff down, it has to be some genuine dispute of facts. They don't get it until they're sitting around 2 days before trial thinking, we don't really need to have this trial and we're going to get killed here. So isn't there some tool where we could just pare all this stuff down and maybe get out of it? And that's when you get summary judgment. Everybody needs to practice it before they teach it.
Okay, let's talk a little bit more about your practice and what you did. First, what did you do when you got out of law school?
What I really did was I thought, what's going to happen next summer when I don't have my summer vacation? Is what I did when I got out of law school. I went straight to the antitrust division of the Department of Justice. I had thought I was right in the middle of doing a PhD in economics at the same time I'd done law school, but I had a chance to leave and go work for the antitrust division, and it was one of the few jobs I really wanted to do as a lawyer, so I went ahead and I did that.
Why? What was it about it then?
I wanted to do antitrust. Antitrust was the prototypical law and economics subject. I'd been interested in antitrust since I took an undergraduate industrial or organization economics class. And I thought if you're going to do antitrust and you're going to be a lawyer, that you ought to go to the Justice Department and do it. And so I also thought that's working for the government is public interest oriented. I wasn't interested in working for a law firm. I thought I'd get good questions. I thought it would be an utterly compelling thing to do. I also thought I needed to leave California for a while. I'd been there all my life. And so it was a chance to go and see a different part of the United States, too.
And did it meet with your expectations?
It was interesting. I left California in summer of 1980 after being hired under the Carter administration, and in November of 1980, a whole bunch of Reagan folks followed me to Washington, D.C., and some of that was what I was trying to get away from California from to some extent. So the antitrust division turned into a place where you had to really sort of trick the front office if you wanted to bring a case at all, and that was sort of disappointing. But yeah, it met my expectations. I was real lucky. I got into transportation section, and I found a whole lot of really interesting things to do having to do with deregulation of transportation industries. It let me use my economics. It let me be a lawyer. It let me see a whole bunch of different aspects to the practice of law. It gave me responsibility very quickly. Before I even had passed the bar, I had to cross-examine somebody at the Civil Aeronautics Board in an airline merger. And it's terrible on your stomach lining, but it's very, very good in terms of letting you do stuff. And it was weird because somebody dropped some file on your desk and in so many words says, okay, you are now the person in the United States who's responsible for vindicating all of the citizens in the United States' interest on this particular matter. If it's a bad merger, do something about it. It'll all you, and that's great. And you get to do that right away, and that's sort of what I was looking for.
Do you think that's true of most government jobs?
A lot of them, yeah. As soon as they find out you can do stuff, they tend to overwork you, but you get to do stuff right away. Yeah, that's true about almost all government jobs. There's a hierarchy, but there's not an excess of government lawyers. So if you want stuff to do, you get a chance to do it. I'll say something else about the government that I hadn't really thought about, but was really nice, is everybody's sort of in it together, and the people that I met at the government and that I worked with at the government are lifelong friends, even though most of us have now left. There is a sense of togetherness there in groups that is really worthwhile. And one other thing about the antitrust division in the government that I really enjoyed is the client is the public interest. And sometimes I say that really the only way to practice law is with the government, because when you practice law for clients, you are working for the client in the end. In the government, you are really trying to figure out what's the proper thing to do. And yeah, politics gets in the way, and yeah, incompetence gets in the way. But to some extent, if there's something you think should be done, you do it. And if there's something that you think should be stuck on a shelf and leave it alone and make it go away, you do get the ability to do that. So you can figure out what the rules are and what the whole thing is about and what the purposes are. And you can actually sort of do that in the government, and I think that's actually true much more in the government than it is in the private sector.
What about billable hours? Did you have to worry about that?
None. Although, now the government makes lawyers fill out timesheets so that they can ask for fees in certain cases. It's appalling. I don't think I worked any less than private sector counterparts. We were all, if you got a case, you got stuff to do. What was good is there weren't billable hours. There wasn't pressure to work. The idea after you've had a difficult case, and if there's some downtime, you take some downtime. Of course, Washington, D.C. has this thing about defining you by how early you come in and how late you leave, and did you go to the party with a congressperson or did you go to the party with a senator? And so that was always sort of there, but there is not billable hours in the same way.
Do you think it would be hard to have that kind of job and have a family?
A lot of people did. Mm-hmm. It's hard to have any kind of job and be a family, is what I have learned from having a family, which is that the truth is you're trying to do two full-time things at the same time. And if you care about your job, and there's no way to do a job if you don't care about it in the end, you just don't have enough time. It's very hard to be a lawyer, especially a lawyer that is working on other people's deadlines at all, and that's practically the job of being a lawyer, no matter what you're doing, is other people's deadlines. Judges, other counsel, co-counsel, opposing counsel, whatever it is, that makes it very, very hard to have a family. You can do that, but it's hard. And what you end up doing, if you can at the government, but you can do this private practice too, is you just take on less work. But everything you take on, then you're responsible for, and it's difficult. And so everybody just sort of muddles by.
So if this is a problem that everyone faces, do you have any advice or thoughts about how you balance two full-time careers? Oh.
It's extremely difficult. I don't have good practical advice about it. Right now I have a job which is as good for balancing as I think is possible. I mean, you can't find a better job for it, but I find it extremely difficult and extremely dissatisfying, and I feel like I am half-assing both of the aspects of it. So no, I don't have practical advice.
So give me examples of what are struggles and sort of what solutions you've figured out, or give me a typical day, or sort of some details on sort of how this all works with having a family.
Well, a typical day, I get up at about 5:30 because my younger son is ready to get up. If I'm lucky, I can get a run in, or maybe I'll take him out for a little walk to get a little exercise. Then, if I'm doing a small section, then somewhere in there I've got to read some papers in the morning, because my brain doesn't stay fresh past, about 11:30 or 12. So then I'd maybe try and do that a little bit. Then my other son gets up, and I've got to take him to preschool. Then I get in here, and then I got to prepare for class, because I have to prepare for class. So that takes a while. Then I have to teach class. Then I need to talk to students, because I really do not believe the thing to do is just blow out of class right after you've taught a class, because in fact people are there, they want to do work, they have things that are bugging them, they have questions, you can really work on that. So then that takes some time. Then somebody's got to go pick up my older son at preschool, because that's about 1 o'clock then. So somewhere in there, maybe I get a little bit of lunch, or maybe I don't get a little bit of lunch. Then I need to work in the afternoon. I usually have office hours. I usually talk with students. I've got to read papers and mark papers and think a little bit about what's going to go on for the next day of class. If I can get home at about 5:30 or 6, and immediately both of my children will physically accost me in some way, and I'm not getting any younger, and then they need meals, and then I usually put the younger one to bed. I give them both a bath, and then I need to read to the older one and put the older one to bed, and so that usually ends up about 8:30. Then I've got from 8:30 until I fall asleep to do everything that needs to be done that I can't do with either a student or a child hanging on my arm, and usually I fall asleep by about 10. So that's a typical day, and that's every day. It doesn't leave a lot of room. It doesn't leave room for relaxed pondering about academic questions. It doesn't leave room for attending a lot of faculty enrichment seminars. Everything is pushed really tight. So no, I don't have real advice. I think it gets better, but the truth of the matter is, all the time I'm sitting in my office, I really wish to be spending more time with my children. And a lot of the time when I am spending time with my children, there is a little portion of my teaching brain thinking, I think I'm going to suck a little bit in class today compared to how I could do if I spent a little bit more time and had a little more care for what I was doing.
So what do you do? I mean, so what do you do to not feel that way? I mean, do you just accept that and then just move on with it, or do you give in to that sort of feeling of? I mean, we've heard that before. That sort of you're torn constantly between the place that you are and the place that you will be next, kind of thing, or the place you should be. Just accept it and say this is just it, or do you ever just, I don't know. I mean, it's probably a dumb question.
I seek out as many situations in my life where I can genuinely feel moral indignation about something, and then I feel it for 3 minutes, and then I don't have time for that anymore, and I move on to something else, but then that makes me feel better. That's a little bit of a release. No, what I think about is a couple things. Unfortunately, I chastise myself a little bit, thinking if I were really efficient, if I were really better, if I were really more capable, I could do this all a little better. And I look around at other people who seem more adjusted and think, well, why can't we do a little more like that? But that gets unproductive. So I force myself to draw limits and identify what those are, and then try and be happy with what I've got and think about all of the things that are decent about what I've got. So no, I don't accept it, but it requires effort, but there is a way to think about things positively. And that's what I try and spend my time doing. And in my good days, I do that a little bit. And in my bad days, which are 9 out of 10 of them, just don't get around to that. So then I sit and sulk.
Well, we're going to run out of time, but I'm just going to go give you some more questions.
Okay.
We'll have to do a part 2 of you because it's going too fast.
Okay.
What about your hardest moment, trying to balance some of your hardest moments and some of your best moments in terms of trying to keep this balance? And I'm not sure if that works, but...
My hardest moments are really my own personal... It's almost grief, especially for my older son, about having to leave him with childcare and go into work. And they were hard because it's just like turning and leaving when everything about what I was feeling was that I should just not do this. And those took an interesting toll just because it's hard. Now, in fact, I believe it was better for my son to do that. But those were the hardest moments. The best moments are things like teaching a little bit of antitrust with Leo on my arm, and having either of my children come in and seeing students immediately gravitate towards my child and then look up at me with that, oh, it's you. Well, I suppose we'll have to say hello to you, but what we really want to do is we want to talk to your child here. And you can just sort of stand here while we're doing that. And those, because I'm already very proud of my children. I love to have my children come around my work and have my children see what I do. And my older son sometimes wants me to take him into the classroom, and he wants to sit in the back of the class and raise his hand and have me ask him questions, and then he wants to come down to the front and have me sit in the class and I'm supposed to ask him questions. And those are the best things about it, to the extent I can incorporate my children into my job and not have it be something that takes me away from them or takes them away from me. Those are the best things.
Do you think that you're unusual being male or being a man and caring and having this so integrated in your life? And do you think it's still like balancing is still like only a women's issue? Oftentimes that only women are really thinking about this, or is it changing?
That's a really interesting question. I don't like thinking of myself as unusual because it's not like I set out to be this way. That's just the way it is. I don't know. I do feel like I'm different from a lot of other men, but I don't know whether the difference is that they don't feel it or that I just happen to be much more capable of articulating my feelings and that what it really is a reporting bias. It's just that you get it out of me the way you don't get it out of other people. If you really ask me what I believe, I don't believe other people feel it as strongly. Other men feel it as strongly. But no, I don't think it's a women's issue. And in fact, I find a lot of women don't feel the way I feel about it at all. It's an issue related to some parents. And it really has to do with people who probably are a little too strongly attached in some ways and have difficulty recognizing that there are a lot of different tasks in life. I don't really know that I expect the rest of the world to accommodate me and my feelings, because I think the rest of the world is entitled to expect an awful lot of me as a law professor, and I expected an awful lot of law professors when I was a student, and there's a minimum standard for that, and I ought to be able to meet it. And that's a little different from thinking about it as a male or a female issue. And in fact, I would like it if the world accommodated people who have children, but I don't think that's going to happen.
Why? Because it's a capitalist system.
Yeah, I mean that gets into antitrust related. Because markets don't quite work in that way. Because someone will be willing to come along and do the same thing for a lower price or a better thing for the same price or something. Yeah, and not only that, but I guess I believe human beings gravitate towards that system. It's not that a capitalist system has been imposed on human beings, much as humans gravitate towards that for reasons, and there are so many people now that we are basically stuck with that. I think a lot of people do very well at recognizing and accommodating to some extent the fact that you have children. I think the law school has been very, very good about it, and the world is pretty good about it, but markets move on, and markets are impersonal, and markets are about winners and losers, and we're all in these markets, and yeah, that's why I think things are not really going to adjust that much.
So do you think you could do this if you were practicing law?
Do this meaning
doing the schedule that you have now, right? The way that you've sort of set your life up.
Yeah, I think oddly for me, I care an awful lot more about teaching in my students than I would about making money, which is in the end what the practice of law is about. So I think I would be more successful in limiting my hours and not particularly feeling bad about not spending more time for a particular client's matter. For the government, it's a problem because it is on behalf of everybody. Mm-hmm. So I don't know about if it had been as government, but the problem with teaching is that I'm responsible to my students, and it's the one chance I have to take contracts or antitrust or community property or ad law or whatever it is. So that always kind of nags at me, and that makes it hard. In that way, teaching is not the ideal job for adjusting. A job where you could, in good conscience, put it down very quickly and not worry about it. I think for me it would be easier.
So any advice in terms of like people who do want to be involved in their children's lives in terms of how they choose where they're going? It's a really hard question, but there's just constantly this thing of that's one of the fears. I mean, obviously the focus is always big law firms, and that's not where everyone goes. So that aside, just any thoughts about that?
Yeah, my advice is decide really carefully whether or not you want to have children and all of what it involves. And in the end, what it involves is probable significant sacrifices in terms of career aspirations. And my advice is to not expect that the world is going to revolve around you. And instead, you have to decide in advance that it's worth it, that you're not going to be this respected managing partner because what you've decided to do is devote a massive amount of your energy to something way more important, which is your children. And that may be the way it ends up. So you won't get the same level of respect in a profession that you might get if you spent the time and emotional effort on the job that you instead spend on your children. So my response is, think about that in advance and decide. But if being a parent is more important, and I happen to think for me it is, then when you're discouraged and when you are not getting respect that in fact you deserve, then what you need to think is, yeah, but this was my decision, it's worth it, look what I have, look what I'm working on, and deal with it that way. I think if you go into it expecting, I can do it all, and it will all,
You'll blow up.
there's just going to be disappointment. I think the disappointment ought to be on the professional end rather than on the parenting end. There's going to be disappointment having to do with my children too.
Okay, so let's say you don't achieve, like, you're not like the most respected person in the entire world, and you don't have like all the money you haven't gathered every single penny from the entire world. Oops, sorry, Jerry. You're still going to be okay, right? I mean, that you don't have to. I mean, I guess that's the thing about this notion of like you won't be like your thing. You might not have the strongest reputation. Somebody might have a better reputation than you do. Sort of, it's okay to make those choices, I guess, is my question.
Well, you have to make them. It's not okay. I mean, it is a sacrifice. In other words, it's, to some extent, it's a road not taken. And, yeah, it's all okay. I mean, in that way, I happen to be fortunate in that money is not very important to me, not because I have gobs, but that's just not where I head at all. So whatever happens with that happens, but it's all real important to me. And no, it's not okay if there was a way to be better and I couldn't do it, but that's life. It's not quite okay. I wouldn't tell anybody it's going to be okay either. It's going to embitter you in some ways, and that's that whole thing about life isn't where you end up, it's the journey, and it's how you deal with that. It's not boring, but it's not necessarily okay. But I also don't believe on their deathbed too many people are sitting there thinking, if only I had produced 2 more law review articles, then everything would have been all right.
So how soon in your life do you have to make these decisions and choices? Do you make them along the way, or do you make them, like, do you plan when you graduate, or sort of how much?
I sure didn't. I didn't make them a long time in advance. For whatever reason, I think I had a good idea of what it was going to be like. I think I had a good idea about what law school was going to be like. I think I had a good idea what practice was going to be like. I had a good idea about what teaching law as a parent was going to be like. I don't think you have to have it all planned out. I do have advice which is contrary to that, which is if you have this whole thing mapped out, you're not going to be flexible enough. And things change. One example of that is I had no thought about going into law teaching when I entered law school. I had no thought about going into law teaching when I left law school. I didn't have a plan about when I was going to have children. You have a plan about when you're going to have children, and by such and such a date that doesn't accommodate who you meet and whether they're suffering from serious mental illness or whatever it is. So.
Well, I didn't want to make you late to your appointment, so we'll stop in just a minute. But I would like, if we could do, don't you think we should try to get another session in sometime?
Yeah.
So does that sound good to you?
Sure.
Okay, because we just got to just a little bit.
We just got to a little bit.
Don't you think? We did some good stuff, but we have some other stuff to do.
I have no idea, but I do have enough sense to know that I will not commit to a specific time and date while on tape.